The words for our call to worship this morning come from Nelson Mandela. I have walked that long road to freedom. I have tried not to falter. I have made missteps along the way. But I have discovered the secret that after climbing a great hill, one only finds that there are more hills to climb. I have taken a moment here to rest, to steal a view of the glorious vista that surrounds me, to look back on the distance I've come, but I can rest for only a moment, for with freedom come responsibilities, and I dare not linger, for my long walk is not yet ended. Let us walk together as we come in worship this morning. I invite you to settle in. Love, you are as strong as a dark blue mountain. Love, you are as fluid as a wide silver river. Love, you are as splendid as a clear night sky. Love, you are as mysterious as a deep forest. Love, you are as wise as enduring friendship. Love, you are true power, not mere distraction. Truth, not deceit. Purpose, not impulse. Poetry, not prose. Now more than tomorrow, but tomorrow more than yesterday. Love, condense yourself into this moment. Permeate the silence that joins us in community, so that in the fire of the words to come, the promises of this hour might be sealed in peace. I love my brother David. I really, really do. We have been through a lot together, and we know that when the chips are down, that we can count on each other. We celebrate marriages and children and holidays together, and we mourn together over losing our mom and those things that happen in families that bring sadness. But I can't even begin to count the number of times over the past years that we've looked at each other, shaking our heads in bewilderment as to how two such different people could have been born and raised in the same family. We are diametrically opposed on almost every issue, especially when it comes to politics and religion. Why are we so different? And then the thought follows, of course, why can't he be logical and just see things my way? And I'm sure he's probably saying the same thing about me. Anybody else relate to this? Yeah. As our story this morning points out, we are all alike in some ways and all different in some ways. And the question is why? And so here's part of the answer as laid out by Jonathan Haidt. He's a professor of psychology. And he says that within our very genetic structures are the mechanisms that make us individuals and give people brains that are more or less reactive to threats and more or less reactive and susceptible and receptive to change. And these two personality factors have been consistent in defining liberals and conservatives. People with brains who are less reactive to threats and more receptive to change and diversity are predisposed, but not predestined, to become more liberal. Whereas people with brains that are more reactive to threats and less receptive to change are predisposed, but not predestined, to become conservatives. Of course, then, once we're born, we follow different paths, we have different experiences, and we create different life narratives, all the while acting on this innate genetic sensitivity that regards change and threat. And then when the time comes, we align ourselves with the overriding political narrative that fits us best. Some of us choose the heroic liberation narrative of liberals, and others of us choose the more defense narrative of conservatives. Predisposed from birth to tend toward one end of the political spectrum. That explains a lot. We live in a time of political divisions that have reached what I think are an intolerable and destructive crescendo. On a national level, it seems that our elected leaders are unwilling or unable to form the coalitions necessary to move our country along in a civil fashion, or in understanding the fine art of compromise. Instead, we have a situation with intense groupishness along party lines, both ends of the political spectrum, with both leaders and followers shouting at each other, prioritizing party loyalty over the good of our country. And we've seen the shift to this more sort of tribal mentality and a more self-constructed righteousness than most of us can probably remember. I don't know about you, but I truly sometimes feel like Alice in Wonderland gone down the rabbit hole to this bizarre world. So how do we find our way out of this mess? What will it take to forge a path that leads to constructive communication, whether we're talking about the whole nation or just within the microcosm of our families? Ever the optimist and ever the Unitarian Universalist, I do think that the future holds hope and cooperation. Whether this will be born of reason within, or whether it will be foisted upon us from a crisis without, remains to be seen. But an understanding of why we are the way we are is vital to moving ahead. And I've drawn from Jonathan Haidt's excellent book called The Righteous Mind for some of the ideas and theories that follow. This book was given to me by a friend at my ordination in 2012 and remains one of my favorites. In my description of the sermon today, I don't know if you read the little sermon blurb, but I invited you to join me in taking the red pill. This comes from the movie The Matrix, in which the main character, Neo, has to choose between embracing the sometimes painful truth of reality, which is the red pill, or the blissful ignorance of illusion, which is the blue pill. And most of the time, and by that I mean we humans most of the time, muddle along in blissful ignorance of illusion. But if we choose the painful truth of reality, this is one of the realities that those of us here need to face. As Unitarian Universalists, we highlight reason as a cornerstone of our common endeavor, but we and all people may not be as reasonable as we think we are. So what are the two topics that our mothers told us never to converse about in public? Right. And the great Mark Twain wrote, "I'm quite sure now that often, very often, in matters concerning religion and politics, a man's reasoning powers are not above the monkey's." How right he was, we're about to see. So politics and religion are expressions of our underlying moral psychology. And an understanding of that psychology might just help us understand ourselves and one another a bit better, and maybe, just maybe, help bring people together a bit more in these two difficult and fraught areas. As Unitarian Universalists, we hold the 7 principles that we covenant to affirm and promote. And these principles speak to the best of humankind, how we can move in our world as individuals and as a community. How many were able to watch that excellent Ken Burns documentary that Susan mentioned earlier, Defying the Nazis, on Tuesday? I know some people might have it taped. If you're interested in watching it, we can probably show it again. I for one, would love to see it again. If you watched it, you saw what can happen when our principles are acted out on a world stage. This documentary showed the heroic actions of the Unitarian minister, Waitsil Sharp, and his wife, Martha, as they left all that was comfortable and safe, including their 2 young children, in the U.S., and they journeyed to Europe to help Jews, refugees, and dissidents to escape the expanding Nazi threat in 1939. They were motivated by their Unitarian faith and by moral outrage. Now, not all of us would have the courage or the capacity to do what the Sharps did, putting their very lives on the line in a time of peril. But surely they stand among shining examples of our Unitarian and Universalist forebears in living out our principles. And we keep living out our principles, putting our faith in action, standing on the side of love, letting our very lives speak our principles. We hold that people have inherent worth and dignity, and that on the whole, human nature is intrinsically moral. But we also understand that human nature can and does have a dark side that raises its head in ways both large and small. People can be moralistic, critical, judgmental, and flowing from this can be cruel and evil. We are, all of us, deeply steeped in a concept of righteousness. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's a feature of our evolutionary design, and it's part of our normal human condition. It's what's made it possible for human groups to coalesce and bond beyond the narrow confines of just our families. But at the same time, it is our righteous minds that continue to create conflict, and sometimes extreme conflict among groups. Maybe it's too much to hope for world peace. In fact, that may not even be a desirable end, even if it was achievable. Is that heresy to say that out loud? You heard me say many times that conflict is not a dirty word. When conflict is engaged constructively, it can become a catalyst for growth and change. So perhaps a more realistic principle for our UU7, instead of goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, might be something along the lines of the goal of a system of checks and balances that would hold competing ideologies together with accountability, and maybe less people thinking that what they consider a righteous end justifies a violent means to get there. Sort of like the ideal vision of our United Nations. So here's where it gets real, and perhaps a little bit difficult to hear. The title of the sermon is Moral Intuition and the American Electorate. Moral intuitions are automatic. They're things that we take as givens before rational thought and reasoning kick in. Intuitions come first, reasoning comes second. And I know this is a hard concept for us because we think of ourselves as thinking and reasoning and rational people, but the reality is that most of our mental processes are actually based on this moral intuition, or blicks as I've called them before. So our conscious reasoning, what we say and use to justify our beliefs, what we normally consider the main part of our mental process, is really only a minute fraction of our mental process. Philosopher David Hume, and indeed many others throughout time, have pointed out this reality. Hume in 1739 claimed that moral reasoning is a servant to moral emotions. And yet again, we have this linkage of our heads and our hearts. And now we're saying that the role of the heart and the emotions, which is the moral intuition, is leading the head, the moral reasoning. People make moral judgments immediately and emotionally, and then the reasoning usually is a post hoc construction. It comes after to try to justify those immediate judgments and also to convince others to join us in our judgment. Intuitions first, strategic reasoning second. So the image that Haidt uses in his book that I thought is very useful, it's like a rider. You have a little rider and then this big Mongo elephant. The rider is much smaller than the elephant. And in this analogy, the rider represents our conscious reasoning, whereas the big elephant is our moral intuition. If this is the case, if he's right, then anyone who truly values truth should stop worshiping reason. Reasoning evolved not to help us find truth, but to help us engage in arguments and persuasion that support our moral intuition. Not that we need to give up our reasoning. There is hope. The best of our reasoning comes when we come together to produce some good reasoning that goes beyond our already individually held intuited position. As children, we learn about morality both in our family and in our circle of friends, but also as part of a particular culture. And herein lies the key of potentially changing people's minds. Our moral intuitions and judgments can be changed. They're not set in stone. And this insight isn't new. Henry Ford said, "If there's any one secret of success, it lies in the ability to get the other person's point of view and see things from their angle as well as your own." And Dale Carnegie advised people to avoid direct confrontation and instead use those techniques of social persuasion and reasoned social persuasion techniques. And the key here is to get out of that righteous combat mode, that moral intuitive mode, and try to listen empathetically. Okay, so especially germane to this election season, Haidt outlines a moral foundations theory. If you're interested in this more, I advise you to get the book. We're going to do a quick romp through it today, pretty quickly, but it's so interesting. He talks about this moral foundations theory of the righteous mind, and he also talks about why conservatives have an advantage. He argues that liberals have three foundation morality, and they emphasize the first three. So care, liberals are sensitive to suffering and need in a universalist sense. Fairness, liberals prioritize equality. And liberty, liberals are concerned about vulnerable groups. Conservatives, on the other hand, rely on all six of these moral foundations, which actually gives them the ability to trigger more parts of our moral intuition. You wonder what's happening now. They are able to trigger all six of these moral foundations, whereas liberals are only triggering usually the first three. So conservatives do care about the same moral foundations that liberals do, but with varying interpretations. So liberals prioritize the care foundation more than conservatives and are disturbed by suffering and violence. The fairness foundation for conservatives is less about equality, and it's more about proportionality. People should get what they deserve, that law of karma. And for conservatives, the liberty moral foundation doesn't mean concern about vulnerable groups as much as it is the liberty to be left alone. And then the remaining three foundations show the biggest partisan differences. Liberals tend to deprioritize these, while conservatives embrace them. Their loyalty, so for the conservatives, loyalty to group and community and country, and again, liberals tend toward that universalism. Authority, which is hierarchy, obedience, and respect, whereas I almost hesitate to say this out loud in a UU congregation, but liberals tend to oppose this foundation by opposing, usually, hierarchy and inequality and power. And finally, there's the moral foundation of sanctity, which both groups use, but conservatives lean on to a greater extent. Sanctity of marriage, sanctity of life, the non-pollution extension to the out-group members such as immigrants and so on. Is this helpful to explain why sometimes we have difficulties understanding those whose ideas and opinions are different than ours? It's not just that they're not thinking right, it's that we're actually starting from different points. Once we join a political side, we use a grand narrative that's based on the moral foundations to see all of life. And so I see two ways through to a more constructive future. One is to be aware of our own grand narrative and to really seek to listen, to really hear others' narratives. What are their concerns? And where do they fit into this model of moral foundations? Knowing that we're all disposed to fit somewhere on that change continuum and threat continuum lends insight into why we hold these differing views. Good-hearted, good-thinking, good-intentioned people can come to different conclusions, complex decisions about all issues. And so we need that point of balance and a common understanding as far as possible. And a second way to a more constructive future is to foster relationship. It's so much easier to have these discussions and even agree to disagree if necessary when there's a relationship built of trust and goodwill. We need to rebuild that desire to work for a common good, even if the particulars of how to get there might not always mesh. And in concluding, I'd like to say a quick word about our own beloved faith. We are people who have come together as religious liberals, and we pride ourselves on being a creedless faith, open and welcoming to all. But sometimes I wonder if liberal political beliefs have so infused our liberal religious beliefs that there's almost a subtle doctrinal test to be part of the community. And I'm not saying this just about Live Oak. I'm saying this about all Unitarian Universalism. Some years ago, in a Unitarian Universalist congregation I served, one of our members was very religiously liberal, but very politically conservative. And he was one of the most loving and ethical people that you could ever wish to find. And he and I, as you can well imagine, had many conversations, we'll call them conversations, about politics, but always with that relationship, always with the love. And it always bothered me that he felt this sense of unease. He was so much a UU religiously, but he always felt this sense of unease politically because he was so politically conservative. And so I'm just issuing this as a challenge and a reminder that don't assume that someone is religiously liberal, that because someone is religiously liberal, they're also politically liberal. We welcome all flavors on the political spectrum here. Open your mind, open your heart. Remember that we come mostly from places of that moral intuition, and do your best to move beyond that. Truly listen to all and stay in relationship. Know that there is real hurt, real concern, and real hope out there on people on both sides and all along that political spectrum. And yes, my dear brother David, I love you and I hear you. And although I might disagree with you with every fiber of my being, I never doubt the sincerity of your intentions. And so, as we enter into the final weeks of this run-up to this mind-boggling election, let us remember to breathe. Seriously, breathe. And let us hold before us the admonition of the great Unitarian minister, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who urged his compatriots to cast their votes, their whole vote, for justice, to vote not just with their ballots, but with all of their lives. So may it be for us also.